Hello, my name is Marjorie Van Cura. Today is December 9th, 2024. I'm an artist based in New York since 2002, where I've had studios in Greenpoint, Brooklyn for 10 years and Long Island City for 5 years. I'm now based in Washington Heights in Manhattan, where I've been a member of Cornerstone Studios since 2018. I have a BFA in painting from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and an MFA from the University of Pennsylvania. I was born in Madison, Wisconsin. And as a child, we were always doing arts and crafts type of projects. And my mom was very creative and encouraged us to make things. She would make things like gingerbread houses and gingerbread men, and we would decorate for the holidays, or we would make handmade cards for people. My mom studied art as an adult and was a portrait artist for a time, although it's interesting that her father would not allow her to study art at college. So she was always very encouraging for us to be creative. She grew her own plants from seeds and had an extensive garden of native plants. I also remember that we were composting and recycling as far back as I can remember. That was all her influence. So I was always painting and drawing, which are some of my earliest memories. I did spend a lot of time alone in my room as a young child. And also, I remember we really weren't watching television very much. So I was a child of the 70s and 80s, which was right at the beginning of digital technology. We had an Apple computer at home, and I remember learning static type of computer games like chess and also how to program very basic animated patterns at the age of 8 or 9. So we were definitely a science and art-based household. We had National Geographic magazines, and I remember looking at those images for hours, and I found them fascinating. And I still have visual memories of some of those images, which were a little shocking for a young kid. Um, and at the dinner table, we would always have conversations about politics and current events. My parents would ask for my opinion and encouraged me to think about the larger world. My father studied physics, and in the 1960s, at the University of Wisconsin, as his grad student, he was an early pioneer studying computer data to analyze things like the effect of radiation to treat cancer. Later, he moved the family to Massachusetts when I was 6, in 1977, so he could work for UMass Medical. He started his own computer consulting business for the medical community and later worked for a biolab that did analytic testing to diagnose things like cancer and other diseases. And they took samples from around the world. In the 1980s, the lab where he worked was able to provide data to other nonprofit labs that were trying to decode the human genome. And I remember there was a lot of controversy at the time about genetic testing, and Massachusetts was one state that allowed this type of research to continue. My father created custom programmed computer software to analyze the lab's data and even to move the robotic arms of the lab equipment. I always found this really, really cool. So we were not wealthy, but my parents did prioritize the arts and always had me and my sister in art and music classes. I learned to read music at the age of 5 and studied piano for 5 years and then took voice lessons, which included Italian opera until I was 13. I never felt particularly gifted in music, unlike visual art, which came naturally to me. So I left music as a teenager, and I started to take adult art classes in high school at the Worcester Art Museum, which included nude figure drawing. The museum collection was also my earliest exposure to classical art, and I soon began taking trips to Boston and New York as a teenager to visit museums. I still remember the first time visiting the Met in New York, which was a true revelation, and it really was the most magical place. My childhood experiences made me acutely aware and interested in political events and social issues from a fairly early age. As a visual learner, I was also very interested in looking at visual art and in the process of making things myself. I have several early memories from watching Sesame Street where someone is painting, drawing, or sculpting, and to see something emerging out of nothing was eternally fascinating. As an undergrad student, I was interested in figurative work, and I favored expressionistic figures. I sought out women artists who were not covered in my art history class. I went to the library and looked up Paula Mortensen Becker, Alice Neal, Dorothea Tanning. I also really loved Sheila Klimt, Max Beckmann, Dali, Matisse, and more contemporary expressionists like Diebenkorn and Wayne Thiebaud. Later, when I was developing my voice in abstraction, I was looking at a lot of 1960s op art and artists like Bridget Riley, Frank Stella, who had very electric color palettes and whose work was animating in the eye. And it really was almost impossible to look at some of their work, which I thought was so cool. I enjoyed the multi-layer patterns and organic geometry of Julie Moretu, Kara Walker, James Sienna, Tom Naskowski, and Terry Winters as well. So the work I'm focusing on now references AP News photography of world events, often seen from an aerial view. By studying these photographs very closely, I can create drawings of them using a blind contour technique of continuous line to pull out certain key elements. And the blind contour means I'm not looking at the drawing as I create it, I'm only looking at the reference photograph. So I can hand trace these study drawings onto a translucent film, which is called Duralar, which is an artist medium, just like Mylar. And I can trace the drawings over and over again to create repeating patterns and overlapping iterations of line and color and form. So I'm using mixed mediums like graphite, permanent marker, or acrylic ink on the Duralar. The hand tracing process allows me to create repeated patterns, and it's a process I have been engaged in for nearly 2 decades. I originally became interested in hand tracing because it's related to the idea of how cells replicate in the body as the body ages, and also the propagation of genes from one generation to the next. And I was reading a lot about genetics at the time. So it's very important to me that the repeated lines and shapes are in my work are hand drawn, and the study drawings do abstract the original photograph that I'm referencing, and it transforms the original image. So I also really enjoy this border between abstraction and representation, where you can sometimes still see certain key elements like figures and buildings. I find that really exciting. So, in terms of subject matter, my body of work is inspired by aerial news photography, as I mentioned, of these hyper detailed, dizzying type of landscapes, such as the aftermath of a natural disaster, or the effects of drought and deforestation, or even the controlled chaos of a construction site. This stems out of my interest in science and the effect upon the natural world and the effects of climate change, which I find very disturbing. And so these are images that are difficult to look at, but that I also care very much about the themes. And it's important that I have a very specific source for the study drawings, and that the emotional aspect of the experience, I hope, translates to the final image. My most recent body of work began in 2021 following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the subsequent surge of protests against police brutality and social injustice. I was inspired. I marched in the streets. It was during the pandemic. It was a very fraught, difficult time for so many people. But they did care enough to come out and participate. And I felt like it was maybe a moment where it could be a true catalyst for change, which I wanted to be a part of and I wanted to address in my work. With the reversal of Roe v. Wade in 2022, I was again inspired by this renewed sense of urgency that arose to protests advocating for a woman's right to bodily autonomy, of course, and freedom of choice. So again, these images that I was looking at in the news were very difficult and sometimes even violent. Um, so they affected me greatly. I feel as if protests um, are important. They are a high expression of a democracy. And even if I don't agree with the nature of the protests, I always admire and respect people who are taking time out of their day, that they actually want to try to make a difference. I find that really inspiring. The issues I find most compelling are when there seems to be a critical mass of people focusing on a cause that really captures a worldwide audience. Another example of protests images I was looking at was during the Paris protests and riots against raising the retirement age for pension reform. And I was kind of shocked at the reaction, but people cared very deeply about that issue, clearly. So to report on the news is to report on recent history, even though we don't yet understand the significance of each story. And again, the aerial view of this type of newsworthy event does provide a way to understand it beyond our human scale. And again, these images are very difficult. They're kind of hyper, um, and it's a way for me to make sense of kind of the chaos and bring some sense of order to what I'm looking at. So the biggest challenge of being an artist, I think, is money and time. You really need to be able to manage your time well. You want to try to have a work-life balance, I would think. Although most of us need to have a day job, I personally find it very important to be learning in my day job and to have something that engaging there. And I have actually found working in art galleries to be kind of a good fit for me and to have a full-time job, which doesn't work for every artist. A lot of my friends teach, they work part-time, they have, consulting, they do freelance, they do all kinds of things, but there's many different ways to manage your time and to make sure you pay your bills. And every artist needs to find what works best for them. So, the advice I would give to my younger self is to not worry so much about what other people think and listen to my own instincts and follow my own path. I do believe if you are guided by your work and the work comes first, you can't go wrong. You need to stay focused on your purpose and trust the process and trust yourself. So the Duralar film is somewhat unconventional, I would think, although a lot of artists do use it. I did try the clear Duralar earlier in my work where you could even shine a light through it to cast a shadow on the wall, which was really interesting. But eventually I did move to the translucent film because I wanted to be able to use other types of mediums. So I do enjoy, for example, graphite and that shiny effect of the line and the form, and also the effortless kind of precise line of the permanent marker in contrast. The acrylic ink that I've been using is aqueous and water-based, but it is permanent once it dries onto the film. I enjoy the semi-transparent nature of the inks and playing with that and making some more opaque and some less. I do mix all the color that I use from primary and secondary color palettes, and I like to create those pops of color and that electric feeling. I do enjoy listening to music in the studio, and I tend to listen to the same albums over and over again on a loop. And that allows my brain, I think, to remain focused on what I'm doing. I don't even hear the music for the most part, and I do enjoy the meditative process of working incrementally and slowly over time. So the music can't be too distracting, I guess. I do get obsessed with albums for several months before moving on. I often listen to movie soundtracks like The Hamilton or A Star is Born. And I do like pop music like Beyonce and Taylor Swift. And it's not a very sophisticated list. I really enjoy when somebody's looking at my work and they're trying to find figures or buildings that they're looking at, and they are trying to guess at what's what. And I do think that's quite interesting, the amount of information that they can find because the work is quite abstract. I'm often surprised at even how accurate they are, but I don't want to over explain the source photo and kill that sense of wonder and speculation. Ultimately, I hope that people look at my work and enjoy the visual experience, the color, the complex kind of matrix of line, and that it does capture their imagination. I recently had a show at DFN Projects in New York called Over the Line, and it was focused specifically on the protest series from 2021 to 2024. My work is represented by Garvey Simon Gallery, and you can find my work on her website or at mine, which is marjorievancura.com, and my Instagram is at Marjorie Van Cura. Hope you'll check it out.